Hey guys, this is a quick video going over Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Now, I hate not to be here in class because this is one of my favorite things to go through with you guys. Um, but I have annotated it and we are ready to rock and roll and go through this together. The I Have a Dream speech, I know some people think it's beating a dead horse. Everybody talks about it. I have a dream. That's what, Martin Luther King is known for, those words. But out of all the speeches in human history, there was none that had such a powerful impact or that conveyed such a significant message during a turbulent time in U.S. history when there was a lot of changes going on. And you look at this March on Washington. So this happened in the late summer of 1963, exactly 100 years after Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War. That's going to be important in a bit. So the March on Washington, ultimately, people thought this was going to be utter chaos. Today, we look back on this event as this great positive thing that happened, but people thought this was going to descend into utter and complete chaos. President John F. Kennedy did not attend, nor did he at first endorse Dr. King's speech. He did, however, after he heard how awesome the speech was, and he did invite King to the White House to talk to him. Troops were put all around the Capitol. They really thought this was going to escalate into riots and violence. The Major League Baseball team, the Senators, okay, they were in town that weekend for a homestand. They had to cancel the games both the day of and the day after, okay, because they thought, again, there was going to be riots and chaos. Government employees, nobody was at work, okay. The liquor stores in Washington, D.C. were closed. Many thought this was going to be a combustible situation, and they're like, you know what, maybe we shouldn't add alcohol to the mix. That could make things a lot worse. And also, plasma and blood are stockpiled in hospitals because everybody thought that this march was going to end in a bloodbath, that it was going to be chaos, violence, many injured, or maybe even killed in this. But instead, here's what ended up happening. Obviously, this march ended up being one of the most significant events in all of American history. Okay, I mean, you're talking about 200,000 people that are marching and descending on the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial in the reflecting pool. This is the most famous picture here. I mean, so you think about this, okay? The civil rights movement is in full swing. The fact that 200,000 people showed up for this shows that the movement has some carry, right? That some people are starting to support it at this point, okay? And so this shows you right here the support that the movement's getting. But this speech, okay, is kind of like the tipping point. Like the movement was gaining head of steam. This speech helped really accelerate the movement because what I love about this, and Mr. Harper has always told you guys this, I know, and several of your other English teachers have as well, probably Miss Mason or Miss Etheridge, words are so powerful, and how we use those words can convey such a significant message that has an impact. So, all of you at this point should have a sheet. Okay, you are going to turn this in. Okay, showing that you annotated this and answered the questions. Okay, and that will be easy 10-point grade. Okay, we'll go through this together. Most of this I actually have clips from the original I Have a Dream speech given by King. There is one section I'll have to read out loud, so I'm sorry, you guys will have to hear my voice for that. But most of it will be read by King. Okay, so again, listen to each excerpt, answer questions on your slip of paper, and we're going to repeat for every paper or every part, excuse me. So here's the first thing, okay? So this speech that King's about to give is given from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Washington, D.C. on August 28th, 1963. Now, I want you to think, why the Lincoln Memorial? Well, what is Lincoln famous for in all of American history? And that is freeing the slaves. And he'll talk about Lincoln a little bit more here in a second. So the questions you're looking for is, how does King relate back to prior U.S. history? And to what figurative language does King use in describing the current state of rights for African Americans?
Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty.
Okay, so this first paragraph, 50 years ago. Okay, so it's given in this speech was given in 1963. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is issued in 1863. That's what he says. A great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So the history they're talking about here is, first off, they are talking about Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves throughout areas of the South that the Union Army gained control over whenever they moved throughout the Confederacy. It wouldn't even be until the 13th Amendment that all slaves in the entire United States were freed, but the Emancipation Proclamation was a start. Okay, now, why not just say 100 years ago? Because he has to go weird here. He says 50 years ago. And here's what he's referencing. First off, if you need to write this off to the side, score equals 20 years. Okay, a score is 20 years. So write that off. Here, I'll write it to the side with you guys. A score, well, my handwriting is absolutely atrocious. Score is 20 years. Okay, so 5 times 20 is 100. Why not just say 100 years? Why say 5 score? Well, does anybody know what speech starts like this? 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That is Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Given the same year, that speech was given the same year as the Emancipation Proclamation being issued. And the Gettysburg Address was basically a speech saying, like, all these people that died at Gettysburg, let's not let it be for without a reason. Okay, let's make it to where they died for something, which would be the freeing of slaves. Toward the end of the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln talks about the nation having a new birth of freedom and being united again. But the new birth of freedom is talking about a nation without slavery, with slavery coming to an end. So the previous U.S. history is talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, but also Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that started to free the slaves throughout the United States. Now, so it's been 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued, but then King says, but 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. Now, what does he mean by this? I mean, slavery has come to an end for almost 100 years at this point. 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation and 98 years since the 13th Amendment was passed that ended slavery. So what does he mean here? But he says 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Okay. So the manacles and chains, what is that a reference to? If we're talking about people being in manacles and chains, it is a reference to slavery. Okay. So the manacles and chains reference slavery, but it says manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Okay. We're going to talk all about segregation in this unit. So segregation, you guys have probably heard of, is where, like, they had separate schools for blacks and whites, separate restaurants, different parts of the bus that they had to sit on, stuff like that. It was basically separating the races based on race. Okay, it was separating people based on race. And so segregation was very detrimental to the African Americans because, they were being separated just based on who they were. And we're going to talk about also segregated facilities were not even close to being equal, especially schools. But we'll talk about that next class. Now, the chains of discrimination. Okay, so hatred, um, blacks not getting full rights. Okay, being discriminated against. That's a chain. Okay, so what the figurative language is King is saying that both segregation and discrimination are holding blacks back, that they may quote unquote be technically free, but they're not really free. They do not enjoy the civil freedoms and liberties that they deserve. Okay, now this next clip, you guys are going to have to listen to me talk. I'm sorry. But what you're focused on here is, why would he focus on the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence? What does it say in the second paragraph here? So we're on the next little section right here. When the architects of our republic, talking about the founding fathers, wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. Okay, this note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the question says, why would he focus on the Constitution and the Declaration? This is why I had you guys, while we studied the Constitution and the Declaration at the beginning of the year, but especially the Declaration of Independence, that all men, all people, have the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So why focus on that? I want you guys to think about that and talk about it real quick. Why would he focus on the Constitution, the Declaration? What do those documents state about the United States? So think about that. Those two documents state our founding values. Okay? They state our founding values and what our country is supposed to do, the rights of man, all of that. Okay? And so it's bringing up that everybody's supposed to be created equal, and everybody's supposed to have these unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which, remember, unalienable means it can never, ever, 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 ever be taken away from you. Okay? And that the government, remember, your rights that you have, the government is supposed to protect those. Okay? But then, here's what King says. So the next part, so he focused on the Constitution and the Declaration because it's a reminder of our founding values, but then he says, says, what is he saying in the second paragraph here? It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, okay, sacred meaning like honorable, stuff like that, America has given the Negro people a bad check. Okay, you guys are about to go out in the workforce and all that. You write a check. Okay, so the Negro people have been given a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. So African Americans are not able to cash in and take advantage of these liberties, okay, because they haven't been given them, okay? But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt, okay? So a lot of deep figurative language going on here. The Bank of Justice, we refuse to believe that that Bank of Justice is bankrupt, okay? So justice, being symbolized here is like something tangible you can store up in a bank, but it's saying we refuse to believe that there is no justice. So that's what he's saying. That's what he's saying here. We know what we've been promised, but we haven't gotten that, but we still believe in the future. We refuse to believe that there is no justice, that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt, and that we have a chance of civil liberties. So that is the question for 3. Okay, they're focused on the Declaration. The answer for 3, they're focused on the Constitution and the Declaration because it focuses on our founding values. And King is saying that they refuse to believe that there is no justice and that they are going to push until they get the protection that they deserve. Okay, next section. You guys don't have to hear me talk anymore. We're going to listen to Dr. King now.
Of material prosperity. This nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Sorry, real quick. What did he just quote there? That's right. As I'm pointing to the Declaration of Independence. Okay, carry on.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
All right. First thing I want you to do is go back through that section that we just read, or that King just read. So, and I want you to underline or highlight or whatever every single time King says the words, I have a dream. So go ahead and do that. And whoever is playing this video, please pause it while they do so for the next 30, 40 seconds. Okay. Now, after going through that and seeing, so this is 4. Why is it effective that King keeps repeating the same text structure for every single paragraph? Because it's kind of, somebody might say, oh, this is kind of redundant. He keeps saying the same thing. But this was intentional. It was to permanently put these words in our minds about, during the Civil Rights Movement, about what this vision was going to look like. You think it's been 61 years, I had to think for a second, 61 years since Martin Luther King gave this speech. But it is still one of the most famous in the history of the world. And when you think of Martin Luther King Jr., you think of I Have a Dream. Okay? So it would make this speech memorable. And it would make, therefore, the message of the speech memorable. So that's why King did that. Now, number 5, I'll let you kind of think on your own. But what do you think is the most powerful paragraph in your opinion, and why? So he's talking about all these dreams. And there's a lot you can go off of. That first one, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. He's throwing it back to the Declaration of Independence again, saying, we refuse to believe the Bank of Justice is bankrupt and that, America is going to stay by their founding values. But then he's talking about, in Georgia, one day, former slaves and slave owners will be able to all sit down together at a table and have a meal together. Think about that. That's powerful. These people that obviously had a power dynamic at one point over the other, their descendants, their, down the line, their, grandkids, the sons of former slaves, and sons of former slaves will be able to sit down together and share a meal. He says, even in Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice will be transformed into an oasis of freedom, okay, and justice. So, oasis, in a desert, it's where there's the only place where you can get water. So he's like, even in Mississippi, this really racist place in the South, there'll be an oasis of freedom and justice, a place where all people will feel safe and their welfare taken care of. If we're on the back now, that top line, I've dreamed that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. That's one of my favorite quotes in this whole speech, okay? Because basically what he is saying is that one day he wants his kids to be judged not based on how they look, but the content of their character, what they act, how they act, and what they do, okay? And think about this. We learn about like emotional appeals and stuff like that in literature, like how to invoke emotion into the reader or the listener. Why bring up the kids? What do kids represent? Kids represent a lot of things, especially younger kids, right? They represent, innocence and things like that, but also they represent the future. So one day in the future, his kids will not be judged by how they look, but how they act and what they do, who they are as people. Okay. Last paragraph where he's talking about Alabama, he's saying everybody will be able to join hands together and have peace and work together. And what is so significant about this part? Okay, and we are going to talk all about this. If you look at that first part, with its vicious racist, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. The vicious governor and the racist governor that they're talking about is George Wallace, if you want to write that off to the side. George Wallace, the guy, the man that said his famous quote was segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. That was Alabama Governor George Wallace, who also blocked the schoolhouse door, literally stood in front of the door, like with his actual body, to symbolically attempt to prevent African American students from entering the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Again, we're going to talk about that, but a lot of powerful paragraphs here. Now, 6, 7, and 8, you're looking for was the paragraph listing off all the geographical places necessary to drive his point home. Why or why not? Why was it better to end his speech with a focus that's not just on civil rights? That's 7. And then 8, look back over the whole speech. What do you believe was the most important or essential part of the speech and why? So these will be largely opinion questions, but I still will talk to you guys about this briefly here in a second.
This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. Not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at
last. One of the best speeches ever given in U.S. history and just history in general. So 6 was the paragraph listing off all the geographical places necessary to drive his point home. Again, some people might think that this is redundant, but it shows that this movement, that these ideas are going to go all over the nation. It's not just about addressing this in the South. It's going to go everywhere. Freedom for everybody. And that kind of feeds into 7. Like, why was it better that he did not just focus on civil rights here? He's talking about everybody. Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics were able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. It's better because it makes this message more broad and applicable to everybody, which is going to, in an indirect way, influence the civil rights movement, because these ideas are going to become ingrained in society, and they're going to help propagate and further the civil rights movement in this case. Lastly, number 8, I want you to look back over this whole speech. There's a lot to pull from here. I just want your favorite part. What do you think was the most essential part of this speech and why? So you'll put that at the bottom or at the rest of those. Okay. If you guys have any questions, please let me know and just turn this in. Those of you who are missing NTI work, get that in. That's dragging some of y'all's grades down. And when y'all come back next class, we are going to do some group work that will be an in-class project grade. So be ready for that. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.